Welcome to the Connor's Corner segment of Ask the Lawyer. With us right now is Tom Clavin. About a year or so ago, we talked about Dodge City, Bat Masterson, Wyatt Earp, and we had one discussion once about the DiMaggios in baseball. But we're going back to the Old West right now, Wild Bill Hickok. Tom, you have a book about Wild Bill. What's it called?
It is called Wild Bill, and it's the true story of the American frontier's first gunfighter.
Okay, so what drew you to Wild Bill Hickok? You know, obviously we all know his name, but do we know him?
Well, that's a perfect question for what drew me to the book because, first of all, you could draw a direct line from my book Dodge City to here because several people, when I would give talks about the book Dodge City, which is mostly about Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson, I mentioned Wild Bill a couple of times as being the first prototype, really, of the frontier lawman. And so people said, well, what do you mean by that? And there's just this presumption that because everybody knows the name Wild Bill Hickok, that there's all kinds of books and stuff out there about him. But so I started to look into it, and I said, you know what, maybe this isn't exactly a prequel to Dodge City, but it does, much of it takes place about 10 years earlier, like more in the 1860s into the early 1870s. And I found out that there really isn't a lot out there, certainly in the last 40 years, about Wild Bill Hickok. He's been portrayed in movies. Jeff Bridges did a movie called Wild Bill about 20 years ago. But a lot of times when he's portrayed, he just keeps repeating the same exaggerations, the same embellishments, the same fictions. He had a fascinating life, and it's the facts. Again, sometimes the facts can be as interesting or more interesting than the same tired old legends that have been tossed around for decades. And that's certainly true about Wild Bill. He packed about 5 lifetimes into one life, and he didn't even live to be 40.
Do you start with the Civil War?
I start before the Civil War, and there's actually a connection to it because even the Hickok family were all New Englanders, and it was Wild Bill's father who came to Illinois with his family and then started farming the family. But he had this New England anti-slavery feeling. He was very much an abolitionist, and he used his farm as a station on the Underground Railroad. So young Jim Hickok, his real name was James Butler Hickok. He grew up with this idea that slavery is bad, and if people who think that slavery is good, they need to be fought. So that connection to the Civil War is when it broke out. He joined the Union Army, Hickok. But he was not going to just be one of those guys in the infantry being used as cannon fodder. He became first a sharpshooter, and then he became a spy. And he spent a good part of the Civil War behind enemy lines, sometimes dressed as a Confederate officer, spying for the Union Army.
Well, that's very interesting. I always heard that he was a scout. I didn't know he was a spy.
Yes,
I know it's a fine line, but
yeah, no. Well, the scout for the most part, at least you're staying on your lines. You're looking to see if the enemy is any place near. But as a spy, he was literally risking death that he could be discovered at any point as a Union soldier wearing Confederate. In fact, there's one story in the book where he was discovered who he was, and he was wearing a Confederate uniform, and he was locked in this cabin, and in the morning he was going to be executed. And obviously he escaped, otherwise it would have been a very short book.
I don't know if you would have written a book then.
No, it would have been just one of many stories of somebody in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Right, so, okay, any exploits you want to talk about regarding the Civil War itself?
Well, I think that he had these close scrapes because there were a couple of times he was discovered. There's one story in the book about where he realizes that some sergeant in the Confederate regiment is getting on to what he really is, and he basically challenges the sergeant to a fist fight down by the river. The other side of the river, he knows that the Union Army is camped there, and under the ruse of having this fist fight, suddenly Hickok jumps in the water and starts swimming across the river. And the other Confederates realize what's going on, and this big firefight breaks out of rifle fire across the river, and bullets are whizzing all around Wild Bill, and he barely manages to escape with his life back to the Union lines. So that was just one of his exploits. Another one is when there's a woman named Susanna Moore who was one of his romantic partners, and Hickok met her when she was in a cabin that was being attacked by Confederate soldiers, and he and his other scouts found them and rode to the rescue, and he essentially saved the damsel in distress, and fell in love, and they carried on an affair that went even beyond the Civil War.
After the Civil War, how does Wild Bill become a lawman?
He he didn't intend on it because he was kind of a restless wanderer. He was continued to be scouting for the Army. He was a trusted scout for Colonel George Custer, for example. And he liked gambling, and he liked roaming around, and he sometimes would be a teamster working for shipping companies. And the lawman thing came about because of Hays City, Kansas, was one of the rough post-Civil War boom towns that badly needed some law enforcement. And he said, "Okay, I'll try it." You know, he didn't have to start from scratch. He could shoot with both hands accurately. He was very familiar with weapons. He was a courageous, tough guy. He could use his fists if he needed to. But in Hays City, he did a good job of bringing some law and order to the city. And so when the next job cropped up, which was even a greater challenge, which was Abilene, Kansas, he took the job because it was a challenge. It represented an even greater challenge. He said, "Well, if I could do that for Hays City, let's see if I could do that." I mean, the previous marshal, the guy whose place he was taking, things were so bad they decapitated him. So Wild Bill says, "Well, that sounds like the town for me," because if they need the toughest of the tough, and I'm going to show that I am the toughest of the tough. And sure enough, he became the Marshal of Abilene, and all these adventures and the shootouts and everything like that. And he was so successful that they eventually fired him because he cleaned up the town. And the crime rate was so low. They said, "We don't need you anymore."
Now, how much money was he making back then?
Well, it's pretty standard for a frontier marshal was about $150 a month. That's actually a good salary. Maybe you're making $125 a month. Hickok made $150 a month, and 25 or 50 cents for every dog he shot.
Every dog he shot. Okay.
Yeah. Now he wasn't a cruel man. What would happen though is you'd have dogs that would have rabies or were getting elderly or just bothersome, or these random dogs that nobody seemed to know who they are, own them, and they were getting into people's hen houses and stuff. So they would contact the marshal and say, "I got this dog, needs shooting." And so the part of the marshal's responsibility was to shoot and dispose of the dog, and you got 50 cents per dog.
Okay, I learned something now. So all right. So we got Hays City, Abilene. What's next?
Well, he wandered for a bit. He was an Army scout again. He was looking for a new adventure. He had no idea his new adventure would be acting on the Broadway stage in New York. His very good friend. They genuinely were very good friends. Buffalo Bill Cody contacted him and said, "Listen, I've got this play, and I'm doing it with a couple other, Texas Jack, a couple other people, and basically it's us sitting around a campfire talking and reenacting a little bit some of our adventures." And Wild Bill says, "That sounds like a silly way to make a living, is talking about your own life in New York, about what you did in Nebraska." But Buffalo Bill said, "We'll pay you $100 a week," and Wild Bill said, "I'll try it." So sure enough, this play opens up in New York, and it's a smash. And it stars Wild Bill Hickok, Buffalo Bill, Texas Jack, and a couple other characters, and so they've imported a couple of Indians. And it was a smash in New York, and then they took it on tour. And Wild Bill made a lot of money. He was a big New York celebrity, but he came to hate acting. He just thought it was the silliest, undignified way to make a living. And the night finally came. He couldn't stand it anymore. He took his gun out. He shot the spotlights out and left the theater, and that was it. He left acting behind.
All right. So now, one thing you talked about, he was a great shot. How did he develop that?
Well, he came from a farming family, and his brothers were not interested in weapons other than basic ones. Maybe you needed to shoot an antelope or something for dinner. But he did chores for other farmers so he could buy his own rifle in the beginning and eventually a pistol. And he just loved target practice. He loved going out to for the family and shooting game, bringing back turkeys and rabbits and things like that. And it just was something he found that the combination of something he loved to do and having the talent to do. So by the time that he was a young man, he was a teenager, he was an expert marksman with a rifle, with a handgun. And he that was only going to be for hunting purposes. But then when he got embroiled, he went west and got embroiled in the bloody Kansas feud that was going on in the Civil War, for example. That's when he realized that what a talent, useful talent that was, to be able to shoot a gun accurately with both hands.
After the acting career is over, or after he quits, what happens next?
Well, most people who think they know Wild Bill would have you believe that's when he took up with Calamity Jane. Which is not true. He did meet Calamity Jane, and they spent some time together. He couldn't stand Calamity Jane. He did meet the love of his life, was a woman named Agnes Lake, who was the only female circus impresario in America. She owned her own circus and took it on the road and went all over the United States with her circus troupe. And she and Wild Bill Hickok met and fell in love. And they got married. And Wild Bill said to stay here. You know, she originally hailed from Cincinnati. Stay here. I'm going to go out west where all this gold mines are being found and silver mines. I'm going to make us a lot of money, and you'll come out and meet me, and that's where we'll live happily for the rest of our lives. And that plan didn't work out, because one thing that one of Wild Bill Hickok's stops was Deadwood, South Dakota, and most people know that the cowardly Jack Mccall was the man who murdered Wild Bill Hickok in Deadwood, South Dakota.
Who was Jack Mccall?
Well, there's not too much known about him. He seems to be somebody that tried his hand at gambling. He tried his hand at business. It seemed like he failed whatever he did. He was still a young man. He was only like 24 years old. And he was actually in Deadwood to do some gambling. He was in a poker game with Wild Bill Hickok, and he got wiped out. And it wasn't just Hickok that did it. He just was a bad gambler. And but at the end of it, Hickok took a little sympathy on the guy and said, "Listen, do you even have some money for breakfast?" And McCall says, "I'm wiped out." So Hickok gave him money, didn't loan it to him, just gave it to him and said, "Here, and just maybe you shouldn't return to the poker tables for a while." And McCall was actually kind of insulted by that. He felt condescended to. He took the handout. He didn't need the unrequested advice. So something started, fuming around in his twisted brain. And so the day or two later, when Hickok was playing cards with a couple of friends, and it was one of the few times he didn't have his back to the wall, his back was kind of exposed. McCall so slunk in there to the bar, to the saloon, and snuck up behind Wild Bill and put a gun against his head and killed him.
Is it true he had aces and eights on his last hand?
Yes, the dead man's hand, aces and eights and a queen.
Okay.
And in fact, one of the promotional things that my publisher, St. Martin's Press, did is when they were handing out bound galleys of the book, they printed up 250 copies of a five-card deck of cards. And it was the dead man's hand, and each deck was inserted into a copy of the book.
That's interesting again. Now, let me ask you this. You brought it up, Hollywood.
Yes.
Who's your favorite Wild Bill Hickok, and who's the closest representation to the truth, in your opinion?
Gosh, that's a tough one. The only reason I'm going to say Gary Cooper in a movie called The Plainsman from the 1930s. It
Cecil
was,
B.
Arthur
DeMille.
Calamity
Yeah.
Jane. Yeah. Because there was kind of a physical resemblance. Hickok was tall. He had longer hair than Cooper had, but he was tall and lean. And Cooper in his prime was like that. A lot of the rest of the film is made up. This takes place 10 years before Deadwood. Yet somehow Jack McCall's in the movie. Otherwise, Wild Bill has not been given his due by any means. I mean, you even had Charles Bronson playing him in a movie called The White Buffalo made in the 1970s. There's a movie called Wild Bill with Jeff Bridges where he kind of looks like Wild Bill, but it's again kind of an inventive story. Who did a good job was Keith Carradine in the TV series Deadwood, the HBO series. The first half of the first season has Wild Bill played by Keith Carradine. The drawback there is Wild Bill wasn't even 40 by the time he was murdered, and Keith Carradine was playing Wild Bill, and the actor was in his 60s. So that's what's been one of Wild Bill's drawbacks. We keep seeing him played by old. I think Jimmy Stewart played him once. He's played by older actors, and one of the things my book points out is that he was a young, very active, handsome. There's a passage in the book written by George Custer's wife in which she is swooning after meeting Wild Bill for the first time. So I'd love to see a screen treatment one day that shows him as this active, Channing Tatum kind of guy, young, active, handsome, and distinguished, and at the same time a really charismatic and swashbuckling guy that he was.
Was he a cold-blooded killer? Was he a nice guy? What was he like personally?
He had a code of honor, which basically said, I don't want people to bother me, and I won't bother them, and I won't let anybody get the drop on me, and at the same time, I'm not going to be aggressive to somebody else. He was an honest man. He always avoided conflict when he could. If he could settle something with his fists, he did that. His code of honor was only if somebody is attacking me will I fire back, and he could let somebody else draw first because he was that fast. He was America's first gunfighter. And other people, the sort of like the occupation, if you want to call it that, of gunfighter, began with Wild Bill, with the very first recorded quick draw gunfight in Springfield, Missouri, in 1865. And every gunfighter that came after that, they were not called gunfighters; they were called man killers or shootits in those days. Everyone that came after that was sort of like a spawned by Wild Bill Hickok, and of course that always made him a target because, as we've seen in some books and movies, I mean Shane is an example. Some gunfighters want to retire because they're worried that they're a target. They don't want to have some younger, faster gun come along and kill them. But when Wild Bill was murdered from behind, he was still the undisputed champ. Nobody in a gunfight had beat him.
Why are we interested in Wild Bill Hickok? Almost 150 years after he's dead.
I think there's two reasons. It does seem to me. I mean, the reception of Dodge City is just one indication that I think there's a new interest in not only some of our iconic characters from the American West, but the true stories, not the fabrications, the envelopment. What was Wild Bill really like? What was Wyatt Earp really like? What was Bat Masterson really like? Some of these characters that over the decades have gone off the rails as far as what their adventures and personalities were really like. Let's find out what they were really like. So I think there's that, and I think Wild Bill is in a society where it's maybe it's getting harder and harder to find these self-confident individuals, and Wild Bill was again not an immodest man, but he did have a confidence. He knew that he presented well. He knew he was a handsome guy. He knew he was the best. I mean, he had this philosophy that the reason why I could prevail in a gunfight is the bullet has not been manufactured that could kill me. Now he really believed that. So he would avoid fights, but if he had to have one, he would go into it with a lot of confidence and a lot of dash and aiming to end the fight as soon as possible. And I think today, 150 years later, people find that kind of individualism. He would spend weeks scouting by himself out on the plains. I think they find that kind of romantic notion that's hard to find in modern day life.
Very good. The name of the book, Wild Bill, The True Story of the American Frontier's First Gunfighter. The author, Tom Clavin. Tom, thanks for bringing history to life.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.